And this really lays it all out, doesn't it? It gets to the very heart of the conflict in his life. On one side, you've got this young rebel, chasing pleasure, ambition, even stealing just for the fun of it. And on the other, you have this revered father of the church, a man whose ideas have shaped Western thought for 1,600 years. So, how does a guy like that become this guy? Well, that question is what this whole story is about. And get this, these aren't accusations from his enemies, these are his own words from his book, The Confessions. This quote just pulls you right into his head. It shows us incredible self-awareness. He wasn't just stumbling into sin, he says he actively loved it. And that psychological honesty is what makes his transformation so unbelievably dramatic. So, to understand the saint, we've got to start with the sinner. We're heading back to the 4th century in North Africa to meet a brilliant but incredibly restless young man, a guy who was really a product of two completely different worlds. You can see this conflict playing out right in his own house. His dad was a pagan official, pushing him towards worldly success, but his mom, Monica, was a deeply devout Christian who was always praying for his soul. It was a spiritual tug-of-war, and as a young guy, he definitely leaned into rebellion. He admitted to lying and, in this famous story, stealing pears with his buddies, not because they were hungry, but just for the thrill of doing something wrong. So at 17, he's off to the big city, Carthage. He called it a cauldron of lust, and he just dove right in. He got into a relationship that lasted for 15 years. He had a son named Adeodatus. He was chasing success, fame, and pretty much every pleasure he could get his hands on. But here's the thing about a mind as sharp as Augustine's: pleasure alone was never going to be enough. The real turning point came when he read the works of the philosopher Cicero. It was like a light switch went on. For the first time, he started asking the really big questions. What is truth? What's the point of it all? And that sparked a totally different kind of search. So this intellectual spark set him off on a new journey, but it was anything but a straight line. The next part of his life was this long, winding, and honestly frustrating search for answers that took him across cities, continents, and a whole bunch of competing philosophies.
You can really see how restless his search was on this timeline. After his youth in Tagaste and Carthage, he spent almost a decade following Manichaeism. It was this popular religion that had a pretty clear-cut explanation for good and evil, light versus dark, which really appealed to a young intellectual. But even that didn't stick. His ambition took him to Rome, trying to make a name for himself as a teacher, and then finally to Milan. And it was there that a fateful meeting would change absolutely everything.
The problem was, none of these paths gave him the peace he was looking for. Philosophy, religion, his career, they all left him feeling empty. But through all of it, one thing was constant: his mom, Monica. She literally followed him to Italy, praying for him nonstop. A bishop, seeing her incredible devotion, famously told her, "The son of these tears shall not perish." Okay, so all of this searching, all of this struggle and inner turmoil, it all comes down to one single dramatic moment. A moment of total surrender that would change the course of history.
So let's just set the scene. The year is 386 AD, Augustine is in a garden in Milan, and he is at his absolute breaking point.
You can just feel the raw desperation in his prayer here. He was trapped. He knew he had to change, but he felt totally powerless to do it. He's crying out, asking, why not now? It's the cry of a man who has tried everything else and has nothing left.
And then, right at his lowest point, something really strange happens. He hears what sounds like a kid in a nearby house, just chanting the simple phrase over and over, tolle lege, tolle lege. It's Latin for take up and read. And he just knew. He felt it was a command from God.
So he grabs a copy of the scriptures, flips it open completely at random, and his eyes land on this passage. And it spoke directly to his entire life. A perfect description of the partying, the lust, the jealousy he was drowning in. It was the answer he'd been looking for his whole life. And in his own words, the change was instant. Just like that. In that moment, his decades-long search was finally over. All the doubt and darkness that had tortured him for so long, just gone, replaced by what he called a profound sense of peace. Now, this experience in the garden didn't just change his heart. It changed the entire course of his life. He was baptized, he went back to North Africa, and he eventually became the Bishop of Hippo. And it was from this new perspective, as a respected church leader looking back on his own chaotic past, that he wrote his spiritual masterpiece. Now, to really get his book, The Confessions, you've got to understand that the word confess had two meanings for him. Sure, it meant admitting his faults and sins, but just as importantly, it also meant to confess in the sense of proclaiming or praising the God whose grace had saved him. The whole book is both an apology and a song of thanksgiving.
And the book itself is so much more than just an autobiography. It's really structured in 3 different parts. The first 9 books tell the incredible life story we've just been talking about. But then, he shifts gears and goes inward. Book 10 is this amazing, almost modern deep dive into memory and the human mind. Then the last 3 books zoom way out, becoming this deep philosophical reflection on the nature of time and creation itself. For Augustine, telling his own story was inseparable from exploring the mind and the universe God created.
So you might be thinking, a book written over 1,600 years ago, why are we still talking about it today? Well, the Confessions is truly a story for the ages, and its impact is still felt right now in our modern world.
I mean, the impact is just immense. It's pretty much considered the very first spiritual autobiography in all of Western literature. Before Augustine, nobody had written with that kind of brutal honesty about their own inner demons. His focus on sin and grace would go on to influence huge thinkers like Martin Luther and John Calvin centuries down the road. But I think its deepest legacy is its timeless universal story, the story of what it feels like to be lost and then to be found.
And this is probably the most famous line from the entire work. It just so perfectly captures his central message that there's this deep restlessness inside all of us, this longing for meaning and purpose that, for him, could only be satisfied by a relationship with God. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? Augustine's story is 1,600 years old, but that restlessness he talks about is something we can all relate to. So his story invites us to look at our own lives and ask that same fundamental question: what is it that our hearts are truly restless for?